Just started recording. Oh yeah. Do you guys hear it say?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's
That's
very
a
cute. Just a little
interesting
bear
voice.
recording. Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna start up talking here in like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, my name is James McCool. This is going to be Theory Crafting Slate Talk with me and Pablo and Jason O here over at Paydirt. This is a weekly talk that we do in the Discord, which is free to join, by the way. Go over to Paydirt and go to the members options. You can join the Discord. Free to join. I'm going to be talking about Week 5 NFL DFS Main Slate this week. We go over a lot of kind of like the high-level stuff. This podcast is mostly focused on game theory, though, and leverage and kind of thinking about how to actually beat the field rather than just who to play. So if you want who to play, we also do something called the Bakery, which came out on Friday. Usually comes out on Fridays. That one is more of who to play. This one is more thinking through roster construction and pivots and how to pass field and stuff like that. So without further ado, how are you doing, Pablo?
I'm doing well. I think everybody feels that this is a good slate for game theory players, which I think we pride ourselves on being. And it's good to have some buy games, makes the slate a little bit more digestible. And I think there's some really interesting ways to think about how to get leverage on this slate. And a lot of it is deciding how much leverage you want for your field size, because I think it's pretty easy to get leverage with some good plays that are not going to be that owned.
Yep, agree. How are you doing today, Jason?
I'm doing all right. I echo Pablo's sentiments. I think this is a pretty nice slate where we could find some edge, and I even like it a little bit more now that we have some more recent news. So I'm excited to dive in and just see where we can maybe gain a leg up on the field.
Yep. So as a quick note forward, I just reran projections. It looks like I forgot to take Anthony Richardson out. So he's still showing up. My apologies on that, but we're going to be talking through the Indianapolis situation. So if you're trying to follow along tomorrow and you're listening to this, note that Anthony Richardson was still in the projections when we were talking about this because I am a bonehead sometimes. But that being said, I echo the sentiment here. This is a really good slate, but it's when I say that it's good, I mean that players who are good at DFS are probably going to have a lot of fun building for this slate. I think that it's going to be really, really easy for you to get over leveraged, though. And that's mostly because I think that we're going to have really concentrated ownership across like 5 teams. But it's not like those 5 teams are the only teams that are good plays. So the ownership is going to be concentrated around Green Bay. Green Bay stacks are going to have a lot of ownership. I think they will have the most ownership. And then San Francisco, which I think will have the second most ownership in terms of stacks. And then I think it's going to be Indianapolis, who has, Joe Flacco at QB, who's cheap to pair with Michael Pittman, who's gaining a lot of ownership. I think that is going to be the third highest owned stack and probably settle in somewhere around an average of like 15 to 18% owned if you include Flacco in there, 20% owned if you don't, right? So I think that those 3 are going to attract a lot of ownership. And then after that, you have Houston stacks, which are probably going to be the 4th highest, but that doesn't even include Washington, who's a good stack because of Jaden Daniels, Seattle, who's a good stack because they throw the ball a fucking lot, Cincinnati, who's in a good spot against Baltimore, so Cincinnati and Baltimore, right? Like, you have that side as well. People are going to have a little bit of interest in Arizona. I've heard a lot of talk about Trevor Lawrence and Jacksonville stacks. Like, there are no shortage of ways to go on this slate. And it's going to be really easy for you to look at all of these spots and be like, why aren't people on this? This is so low owned. And then all of a sudden you end up with an entire lineup of players that are 10% or less owned. And you've over-levered yourself into fucking oblivion.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about this slate is how do you play the games that are owned in a way that's different? Or how do you not play those games and play a different stack or different set of games, and then eat potentially a little bit of chalk from those games, so that you get pieces that you like? It's kind of like an easy way to think about it, right? So to sort of piggyback on what you just said, the way people are going to play San Francisco and Arizona will either be to play Purdy, stacks, with potentially Debo, and I don't know that they're going to pair him a lot with Mason, but Mason projects so well, and as you wrote in your pivot article, he could be priced quite a bit higher, and he would still be a good play. Like, he's creeping up, and he's slowly becoming closer to the price he should be at, but he's not quite there yet, especially in this matchup. I think we all have concerns about Arizona's ability to push San Francisco. There's only, I don't know that it matters. I mean, San Francisco may just smash them, and I think in general, blowout risk for NFL is overblown. But it's important, I think, to think about if you're playing that game, how do you play Purdy in a way that is going to be unique with either secondary leverage around it, or play him in a way that other people aren't going to play him. Similarly with LA Green Bay, it's interesting. Given Love's price and given the injuries they have and the price of his pass catchers with Kraft, Reed, and Wicks, and then even Melton, if you want to go dumpster diving price-wise. And then given the bringbacks with Kyron, Whittington, Tutu Atwell, and theoretically Parkinson, if you want to get weird at tight end. I do agree that game is going to get a lot of ownership. I'm not seeing Love as, and this may be a small field, large field thing, but I'm seeing across the industry Purdy as like by far the chalkiest guy, and then I'm seeing sort of Love in the next tier with sort of Daniels, Lamar, Geno, Josh. There's a lot of other quarterbacks people like on this slate. It's kind of a wide open quarterback slate, and so as much as I sort of want to say like forget Love stacks, I do wonder if people are going to play that game more as either minis or as like a Love, Kraft, Reed with a bringback. And it makes me think that if I want to play that game, maybe the way to do it is just to go full blown, balls deep game stack, because I don't know that it's going to be played that way. Like I'm not seeing it. I think this slate in general, because it's smaller and it's the first smaller slate we've had, chalk is going to condense a lot more than we've had in other slates. And I think it's going to be really obvious when the lineups are shown and when the cards are flipped, which players hand build and which are sort of sim opto lineups. And I don't know that the sim opto lineups are going to be pushing like a game stack in that game as much as they will minis or sort of a more skinny stack approach. I'm getting a little bit of background noise on somebody. If you could mute. James, do you have any, or Jason, do you have any thoughts on my thoughts on either? I just want to start there with Purdy stacks because I think they're going to be so chalky, and then kind of how to approach that Green Bay LA game, because I think those two questions are going to make a big difference, especially for small field.
Yeah, so to go off of first, just talking about Purdy, I mean, I definitely want to see what ownership looks like now with Joe Flacco in, because I'm telling you, since Tuesday, every analyst and every site has been pushing that if Flacco plays, like they absolutely love the Indianapolis stacks. So I'm curious to see what that does to Brock Purdy's ownership. But if ownership stays relatively similar to where it is now, I I think Purdy, it's kind of like if you don't play Purdy, you could almost play anybody else you really want to at quarterback. And you just have to be careful with their pass catching options. Um, I think for the San Francisco side of that game too, it's just you don't get too many games in the NFL where a team total is approaching 30 for any given team. And this is something that I've taken from your playbook, Pablo, is that this is one of those teams that I think I want to be very thoughtful about if I'm not stacking. Like, am I getting a piece of them in the right type of lineup? For instance, I'm just speaking out loud here about general stacks, but if I have a relatively low owned stack, I probably want one of Jordan Mason or Debo Samuel in there. Probably more so Jordan Mason. I've heard some talk about the Purdy and Mason combination. And also too, secretly, I think a lot of the sharp players in the industry are going to know this too. Granted, he hasn't caught that many passes. Mason has been running a lot of routes for a running back, so it's not like he's not involved in the passing game. They just haven't really thrown to him. I could see some people just stacking to the brim where it's him, Mason, Purdy, Mason, and then a receiving option. But I definitely think I want at least a piece in that game in most lineups where I'm running a lot of under-owned stacking pieces. I think it's going to give me a little bit more of a better ownership floor and a projection floor. The Green Bay LA game, I'm actually really, really high on that game. And I do want to make that an overstacking place. And real reason why, first off, Colby Parkinson, I'm not fucking playing that guy. If people want to play him, they can. I'm definitely not. I'm more into maybe like a 2-2 Atwell bring back. But the one guy who I really want to target in that game, and he's really my favorite spend up running back, regardless of projection, is Kyron Williams. Again, I want to see what happens with ownership, but this guy has had such an insane amount of red zone usage to really start this season. I saw something crazy on him that he's leading the league with 28 red zone opportunities throughout this week. And it's a really high total game. He's averaging around 7 red zone touches a game. And now he's in this environment. I don't think it's smart to really fade either of those environments. I think I want to overstack that one. I don't really love overstacking the San Francisco Arizona game. I heard a lot of talk about James Conner this week and pieces like that. But I think the LA game makes sense because it is so cheap. And if you overstack that game, maybe the move is you make a slight pivot off of a Debo Samuel to, somebody else in that range. Maybe you make a pivot off of, Jordan Mason. I mean, you're already playing Kyron. He's more expensive, but maybe you pivot from Kyron, from Jordan Mason to Derrick Henry or to Kenneth Walker, like something that just gets you a little bit different. I just want to attack those spots. And like James said, I think people are going to over leverage themselves fairly easily. And I think a lot of people are going to make a lot of mistakes this week by trying to avoid all of the good plays out there because there's so many of them. But yeah, I really want to attack that LA Green Bay game. I love that game, stacking it every which way. I probably want to have like a -5 from that game if I'm stacking it.
So a couple thoughts on what you guys have said. First off, ownership is not going to stay the way that it is. The Jordan Love is going to be the top quarterback. If you run, I just went over to the solver and I ran 100 lineups with QB +2 and at least 90% of the salary ran. If you run 100 lineups, you will get 79% Jordan Love. You get 11% Brock Purdy. Jordan Love is going to be higher owned. This is not a way to like be accurate about ownership projections, but this is a way to be directionally accurate, and Jordan Love is absolutely going to trump Brock Purdy in ownership. Jaden Reed has an 81% exposure in those 100 lineups. Tucker Kraft has a 74%. Dontavian Wicks has 43%. The Green Bay stacks are going to be the highest owned stack. I would be willing to bet that they are 2 times as highly owned as any other stack. So, that's a lot of ownership to eat on any individual game, especially considering not only is it any individual game, but it is a quarterback with his wide receiver 3, 4, and 5 with Bo Melton and a tight end that nobody would play at 5% ownership weeks prior. So it's a lot of ownership, man. I think that it is a fine game stacking spot, but I would also pressure against that. The talk about Jordan Mason and Brock Purdy stacks, I don't mind that, but it is worth saying that Jordan Mason, he hasn't been getting targets because he's not good at getting open. Like, his targets per route run has been consistently under 10%, which is really, really low for any running back. And he's just, Brock Purdy has come out and said that one of the things that playing with Jordan Mason at running back has done for him has made it so he has had to focus more on passing to his wide receivers and his tight ends. So I wouldn't expect Jordan Mason to be involved in the passing game. I do still think that it's such a good spot because I don't think that Arizona's going to put up a fight. But I wouldn't be playing Jordan Mason because I think he's going to have 4 targets. I'd be playing him because I think he's going to have 100 rushing yards and probably 2 touchdowns in the game script. It's going to be the nuts. All of that said, when you run things like the balance on this slate is, like I said earlier, there's going to be a lot of ways to over leverage. There's also going to be a lot of ways you're going to build a lineup that you really like, and then all of a sudden you have like 5 players over 30% owned on accident, and then you're fucked. And basically anything but small field, you're just totally shot. So I think it's really important to be considerate of those things. The Green Bay spot is important to get right. I think I will have a Green Bay stack, but I also think that an interesting way to go about that game environment is to just use Matthew Stafford instead of Jordan Love, and go with something like Matthew Stafford, Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington, or even Kyren Williams, because Kyren Williams gets plenty of targets, right? And then bringing it back with Jaden Reed and Ontavian Wicks. If you think that game really does go to the moon, I almost think that a Stafford over Jordan Love switch and simply just doing that and then doing a QB 2+2, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and one thing that's sort of analogous between those two games is that if you don't play the quarterback either in Purdy or in Love, you can play the running back as a way of sort of saying, well, that game still gets points, but it doesn't go through the pass game. Yep. So you can play Mason. Now, Mason's going to be pretty darn owned. And I tend to agree with you. I think there's going to be a lot of people tomorrow that say, hey, what happened? Like, Love was supposed to be 10 to 15 and Purdy was supposed to be the chalk. And Love is 35% in my small field. I think you're right. And I think this is one of those areas where you just have to say, look, everybody's thinking this because it's so easy to build with him. So with that in mind, I think, and we've talked about it in the Discord a few times over the last few days, I think Jacobs will be quite low owned. And I think if you either don't play that game or want to play like a mini with like Jacobs opposite Whittington or Atwell, I think that's one way to do it, where you get a piece of that game and then stack one of the other games we'll probably talk about in a minute. It's just worth pointing out again that, it's kind of like it's a really easy way to sort of understand leverage. It's kind of like, even if you haven't played DFS for a long time, you can understand where you say, okay, people are playing Purdy, are mostly not playing Mason, and they probably shouldn't be playing Mason, to your point. And so if you don't play Purdy and that game gets points, it's a double whammy if Mason gets there. Similarly, if you don't play Love and Love stacks and Jacobs gets there, again, you're not only not eating chalk that doesn't get there, but you're also benefiting from the benefactor player or players in a game that does get there.
Jason, you got any thoughts on me laying out that I think Stafford is an interesting pivot to Love, just direct?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense, and it's something I thought about too. The only thing that I think you can also do, and I know that you two probably won't agree with this way. This is more of a large field mentality. This isn't really a small field mentality. I also think that if you were to overstack that game outside of using Stafford, if you did want to go the Love route, you would just have to make a pivot. And granted, it's not uncomfortable off of a chalk piece from another game to do that. I like the idea of going with Stafford, Tutu Atwell, and one of either Kyron Williams or Whittington, preferably Kyron Williams. I think that Whittington ownership is just out of control. And then you bring it back with Josh Jacobs and Jaden Reed, or Josh Jacobs and Kraft, Melton, whoever you really want. I think that's a good way to approach it. And also, I will say this: Matt Stafford has had some pretty tough passing matchups to really start the year. Outside of Detroit and Arizona, they just got the blows thrown off them. And Chicago and San Francisco back to back. This is going to be a much easier spot for him at home against a team that does play a ton of zone coverage. And when they do go man, they actually want you to throw the ball deep so they can gamble on interceptions. I kind of like that from an upside perspective. And you just saw what Sam Darnold just did to them too. So I like that. I'm definitely going to be throwing Matt Stafford back in my player pool now for sure.
Yeah, Matthew Stafford's 5,500, man.
Dirt cheap.
He's cheap. He's dirt cheap, right? So I think that's really, really interesting. And to your point about Green Bay having been a matchup that can be exploited, like they are allowing 49 yards over average to opposing quarterbacks right now. It's the second highest in the league, just behind the Ravens, who are allowing 52. And we'll talk about Cincinnati, I'm sure. But that's a good spot. I think that Matthew Stafford as a pivot there makes a lot of sense, because all you're doing in that case, like if you were going to overstack already and you were going to go Love plus Reed plus Wicks plus Tutu Atwell plus Jordan Whittington, right? Like that's a lot of ownership. But then if all you're doing is paying less money for a QB in the same environment with the same correlations, I think that makes a lot of sense. The last thing that I'll talk about with Green Bay before we move on, because we have other things to cover here, is don't fucking play Tucker Kraft. Just, please God, do not eat 25% ownership on a tight end that isn't very good. Just please don't do that. Jason, I know that you'll do it because you like making bad plays like that. You're Mr. fucking But like everybody
whoa! I play them when they're 5% owned. I don't play them when they're chalk.
You wanted to play Jonathan Mingo at 15. Don't try to defend yourself here.
No, he was 7% owned in the sheet, so we recorded the bakery. He got up a little bit more over the weekend. By the way, you're also talking to the same guy that said, "Why don't you go play an unowned Daniel Jones stack?" And he won everybody $1 million.
Oh yeah, well, where's your $1 million? Anyway,
I'm still mentally counting it.
Nobody should play Tucker Kraft. Period. Point blank. Just
trust me, I'm not. I actually X'd him out of my player pool this morning.
Yeah. Can't do it. You can't do it. So the Indianapolis thing, because I think this is another important part. We've talked a bit about Green Bay and San Francisco, and I think that there's a very easy way to look at those games, right? Where if you're not playing a Green Bay stack, you should probably play some Josh Jacobs, and if you're not playing a San Francisco stack, you should probably play some Jordan Mason. But we don't have that same situation with Indianapolis, because that backup running back is Trey Sermon. And I am not entirely sure how much of the workload he is going to get. I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. But in the first 4 weeks, he did in week 2 end up having 34% of the snaps, only 3% of the targets, but only 13% of the rushing attempts. And in week 4, 25% of the snaps, 16% of the rushing attempts. If he ends up getting 80% of the snaps and Tyler Goodson only can manage, 10% or whatever, then I think that he ends up being a good play. But I'm not sure he's going to get 80% of the snaps, and I really don't like him that much if he only gets like 50% of the rushing attempts.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's pretty thin. for the reasons you're mentioning, I think there's fragility there. And moreover, I think there's some really interesting plays in that range, both at running back, or even if you want to play a wide receiver in the flex instead of the 3 running back build, which I think will be more common. But I think the more common approach to that game is going to be to either play Pittman as a one-off, Pittman opposite either Thomas or Kirk. I could see Flacco getting some steam now that he is confirmed in and people will play some Pittman Downs Flacco stacks. This is one of those spots where if you're already getting weird by not playing Green Bay LA or Purdy, and I don't like Trevor Lawrence, and I don't think he's a good real life quarterback, and I don't think he's a good DFS quarterback. But if there's ever a time he's going to work out, I feel like it's in this game. And I don't feel great about it, but I think that playing T-Law with Kirk and Thomas with Pittman opposite it is for sure viable on the slate, given that game total. And Indianapolis, my understanding from the ball watchers, is just decimated on defense. And people who watch a lot more football, like Evan Silva, have talked about that quite a bit this week, that they've been getting carved. And I don't know. I feel like people are scared to play T-Law because he kind of just sucks. But like you get him at no ownership with Thomas and Kirk at no ownership, and then like the only part of that game that has ownership is Pittman across that. It's really not. It's a lot of leverage if T-Law doubles go off.
Jason, what do you think about that Indianapolis Jackson?
So with that game, I had the first initial reaction that everyone else had when they're like, "Oh, Joe Flacco's in. This is great. This is going to be such an upgrade for these wide receivers." And I know we saw a glimpse of it last week. I'm going to argue and venture to say that there's still a massive unknown out there of what it looks like with Flacco. And I don't mean that it's going to look bad versus good, but more about like who he's going to deliver the ball to. This Jacksonville team, man, they run such a heavy man press zone, man press defense. They run more man than anybody in the league. And Indianapolis is full of wide receivers that actually just kind of torch man-to-man defense, right? Like Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, Michael Pittman, they're all well above average in yards per route run against man coverage. And I think, the targets per route run, not that you could throw it out the window so far this year, but Joe Flacco is a much different style quarterback than Anthony Richardson. And I think if people are going to jam in Flacco, and I think he is going to be probably, top 5 owned quarterbacks by, tomorrow morning. I think that a way you can leverage it is by stacking him a little bit more unconventionally, because there is the area of that unknown. Like one guy that comes to mind who popped the first 2 weeks and the last 2 weeks has been a little bit more quiet is a guy like Alec Pierce. Runs a lot of deep routes, torches man coverage. I even think going something as simple as like Downs Pierce and fading Pittman, or Pittman Pierce and fading Downs, if you do want to stack Indianapolis, I think could really be a way to go. To talk about the Trey Sermon thing, James, I'm surprised. I thought he was going to project a little bit better when you ran without Jonathan Taylor. I think that for what you guys play, the large, high dollar, small field, he is thin. I might take a few shots on him in MME just to see if I can capture, lightning in a bottle. And also too, in that range also with him, there's just like Jerome Ford just feels like such a much better play. And I don't think Jerome Ford's going to be owned enough to the point where I should think about fading him. And I also think, Ford, Sermon in that area could be a pivot off of DeAndre Swift, but Trey Sermon, I don't love it, but I'm going to take some shots in large field. And to Pablo's point about Trevor Lawrence, Trevor Lawrence is for sure going to be one of my quarterbacks I'm using. I'm waiting for them to really just kind of let him do his thing, and for good reason, they're really not going to let him do that. But James, you have Jacksonville actually, this week in the upper echelon of teams who are set to drop back, just based upon the research sheets. Actually, no, sorry, I take that back. You have them for a high amount of dropbacks, but their dropback percentage is not that high. So actually, I take that back. I think if you want to make a stack of him, Kirk, and Thomas, it's going to be a pretty thin target tree if you want to try to capture that. But honestly, I think I'd rather use Kirk and Thomas in game stacks. But I'll dedicate a small portion of my portfolio to Trevor Lawrence just in case he finally throws 3 touchdowns this weekend. It's probably not going to happen, but yeah, it's a good game environment though. I want to capitalize on it. I really want to try and decipher how to best use the ownership in that game against people.
Yeah. James, you there?
Yeah, I was muted. I'm scared that I might have to lock Michael Pittman here. And I don't
Yeah.
like doing things like that.
I feel the same way. I think
Yeah,
he's just an
too.
incredibly strong play. He's like
He was strong. He was strong with Richardson in.
He's like a very similar play to what Nico Collins was last week, only $2,000 cheaper.
Right. That's exactly right. He's Nico Collins from last week, but he's only $6,000. Any good wide receiver is going to absolutely rip this Jaguars defense apart. Any good wide receiver, we're gonna attack them all year. They are the people like to talk about Washington being a really, really bad defense, but Jacksonville is allowing twice as many receiving yards over average to opposing wide receivers. They're allowing 193 receiving yards to wide receivers per game, which is the most in the league. 21.8 targets per game. The targets per route run boost is 2%. Washington is 3%. Like this is an insanely good matchup, and it's an insanely good matchup specifically for wide receiver ones because, to Jason's point, they run a lot of man coverage. And if you're gonna run man coverage, you gotta have the guys that can cover the wide receiver one, and they just don't. They just don't. So for 6K, you get Michael Pittman, who's an alpha wide receiver, is averaging over 8 targets per game, gets a boost going up against what I consider to be the best defense to target for wide receiver ones. I don't know how I get off of him. And that kind of sucks, because I also think he's going to be like 30-something% owned. Now, I was fine with playing Nico last week in my Houston stack, but I didn't lock him because he was like 7,400 or something. At 6K, Michael Pittman should be... I don't know how he doesn't score 23 fantasy points in this game or more. So I probably have to lock Michael Pittman. I'm not stoked on it, but I probably have to do it. And then on the other side, I fucking hate playing Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, we all do. That's why we have to do it.
Well, you see, I have 3 lineups, so I definitely don't have to do it. But
I could do it in MME. I don't think you guys should do it in 3 to 5 lineup sets.
I might do it in 3. I'm not sure. If I play 5, I'll do it. If I play 3, I might not.
Here's the main thing. If I have interest in Matthew Stafford, I have to have interest in Trevor Lawrence for the exact same reason. Yep. I just do. From a game environment perspective, I do have to have interest in him. I'm not stoked on it, and frankly, I think that it is harder to look at Jacksonville stacks and feel comfortable about them than it is to feel comfortable about doing it with Ram stacks, right? Like that's my decision. When I'm looking at 3 lineups, even 3 to 5 lineups, I might get to Trevor Lawrence in 5, but I have a lot more interest in Matthew Stafford. I think that they're the same stack. And people talk about the Colts defense being bad. Colts defense is middle of the road. Like it's not that bad. It's not great, but it's not like it's the worst defense. That there are multiple defenses in the league that are allowing considerably more fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And from an above average standpoint, they're allowing less targets, they're allowing middle of the road yards, and they're allowing, I don't know, like the 8th highest fantasy points per game for PPR. So I think that it's a fine matchup. You just have to count on the talent of that team shining through, and I don't really look at them as a talented team.
Yeah, I
Yeah, it
get
would be
that too.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
was
It
just gonna
doesn't
say too.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, Pablo. No, Pablo, you got it first. You got it.
No, I mean I think the safer way to do it, and I think the more common way to do it, will the most common approach to Pittman will be to play him as a one-off or to play him as part of a Flacco stack. Um, and if you're playing a Flacco stack, then you're obviously either bringing back Thomas or Kirk. Um, and that those are almost in flip a coin territory based on everything I've read and sheets and everything else. I think that so those are the two most common ways to do it. Are either Pittman one off or Pittman with Flacco with either Kirk or Thomas coming back. I think the other approach to do it is to play a mini with Pittman opposite Thomas or Kirk, which will be a little less common than those first two approaches. And then I think the least common approach will be stacking Trevor Lawrence, Thomas, Kirk, and then bringing it back with Pittman. And I think it's one of those decisions where, depending on the pieces around it that you like in terms of chalk and your field size, you kind of go down those options to decide which one you like the best in terms of how you want to approach Pittman.
Jason, some closing thoughts on Jacksonville, Indianapolis?
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to say with Indianapolis, and this is something that I said on the bakery, it's something I wrote in the Discord last week. The interesting thing about attacking Indianapolis is that they have a tendency to play really fast on offense, and then on defense, they're this really big, like bend but don't break sort of team. And every team that they've played this season, I'll look up the exact number, but they've seen at least like a 27-28% boost in offensive plays run. I know that that might not mean anything if they don't let Trevor Lawrence, throw more on those opportunities, but it's just something to note. You kind of saw it with Justin Fields, and even they got up on the Steelers, so it was extra good. They're going to let you do a lot of things on offense, and for the boost that they don't give up, that the middling boost they give up to wide receivers, they've been giving up in the upper echelon of a fantasy boost to quarterbacks in general. So I agree. I like Trevor Lawrence for the reasons we like Stafford, and I think it's a low-owned exposure way to get into that game. I just think that I also think the Colts are going to show up as a team that we should just keep attacking. But I don't. I'm with you, James. I think you need an above-average offense or competent team to do it. So we'll see. But I'm going to keep Lawrence in my pool for the same reason why you talked about keeping Stafford in. I'm going to keep him in. And also, I will say, Brian Thomas and Christian Kirk are probably going to get whatever they want in this coverage. If Trevor Lawrence can get them the ball, I think one of those players is probably going to pop off for a pretty big game. Just on the schemes and the routes they run.
For what it's worth, Pablo is right. They're just coin flip. Brian Thomas and Christian Kirk are a coin flip. According to aggregate projections, normal projections, like everything basically says they're a coin flip. So whichever side you want to go with, just be prepared to flip that coin and live with the consequences. Let's talk a little bit about two other stacks that I have interest in. Houston, first off. I think Houston is going to end up nobody over 15% owned. I don't even know if Nico Collins is going to end up over 15% owned. Currently, his ownership projection is 18%. He has the highest median projection just behind Nico Collins, just behind Jamar Chase. And I think that both of those guys are probably going to end up in the 10 to 15% owned range. And especially considering Nico Collins has been the best wide receiver in the league this year so far, against a Buffalo defense that is not good, and has allowed like some relatively big games as well. I just think that he's going to be way too low owned, and overall, Houston stacks coming off a really, really good game. I think that's a really good game environment, right? Like Buffalo side, they should be able to push them. Houston should have to keep their foot on the gas a bit because Buffalo is able to score most of the time. So, what do you guys think about Houston stacks?
Yeah, I agree. Their upside relative to their ownership is very appealing. I think the hard part about them is that that is directly then linked to how much do you like the value on the slate, because Stroud is 7,200, 1,000 more than Purdy, and 700 more than Love, and 1,300 more than Geno Smith, and a lot more than Trevor Lawrence, and a lot more than Flacco. And then Nico is 77, and then Diggs is 69. So I think that right there just tells you why they're going to be low owned, because you really need them to kind of like, you either need them to go like completely nuclear to pay off those price tags, or you need them to do well enough and the value that you play alongside it to do good enough as well. And so I think it's one of those situations where, like, if they hit their 70th or 80th or higher percentile, you could be like you could pass a lot of the field, especially if you like some of the value on the slate, if you like some of the cheaper plays. But if they don't go crazy or your value fails, you can easily get passed by those quarterbacks that are a lot cheaper, that are also going to be a lot more owned. So it's a very first or last play, like, because of those reasons, because they're going to be solo owned, and because you're sacrificing a lot in playing them because of their cost, that if they do well and your value works out, you're probably in first. But if either of those things don't happen, if they don't do as well as you need them to, you fails, you're fucked. So that's kind of how I feel about them. It's like it's an attractive thing for people who have that risk appetite, and because of those things, I feel like it's maybe a little bit more of a larger field play.
Jason, how do you feel about it?
I wish they were just a little cheaper. I love the spot. I'm with you. I think Buffalo's defense absolutely sucks. And even if you look at, for the people that are like game log watchers and box score watchers, they are not nearly as good or effective as they have looked since that before that Baltimore game. Every single player on that defense is like in the bottom half of PFF's positional rankings, besides one player. They have like one player in the top 30 out of any position. They do suck. The only thing is that, like Pablo said, to get that double stack, it's the most expensive stack on the slate. When you put it in your lineup, you're like, oh wow, that's really good, and you can make it work, right? Like, you can go down and you can make it work if you not double punt running back, but if you go like 2 5K running backs or a 5 and a 6K, you can make it work. I think some of the Giants value and the value in Vegas like helps out a little bit. I just think it forces you into some really similar build paths, and if it doesn't go right, it's tough to really stomach. And also your research sheets, you have Houston with the third highest passing touchdown expectation on the slate, but you have 2 stacks above them for a higher passing expectation. Granted, they're a lot more owned. They're also a lot cheaper. And I also think you're getting similar upside in a stack like Cincinnati. That's a little, like, just a hair cheaper, that allows you a little bit more. But I do love that game environment. I think that one of those two, Diggs or Collins, has a really good chance at a ceiling outcome here. I just don't know if I can stack them. I want to. Like, every ounce of me wants to do it because I think the Bills are frauds. But I just don't know if I can really stomach the opportunity cost with what I'm giving up at other places.
Okay, let me convince you guys here really quick. I'm gonna tell you a stack. Here's a lineup that you can actually make. CJ Stroud plus Nico Collins plus Dalton Schultz. Okay, there's your stack. Bring it back with Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel because there's no Khalil Shakur. Your running backs are Jordan Mason and Kenneth Walker. And your flex is Dontavian Wicks with the Patriots defense.
I mean, I like it. Just Dalton Schultz just screams, "I only do missionary with a shirt on." So, like,
Okay, hold on. Let me. Okay, so let me throw you another one. Here's another one.
No, I like it also. I just think that I'm not saying there's anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with being highly leveraged. I just think that for a 200 to 300 man field, I flip the cards there, and I've got like 5 guys below 6%, and I don't. To me, it just feels like too much leverage for a small field.
So let me give you another one here, because this one is not over leveraged. CJ Stroud plus Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz. Again, we're gonna play Dalton Schultz with Curtis Samuel and Dontavian Wicks, who is projected to be 21% owned, 23% owned. Jordan Mason and Tyrone Tracy, projecting at an average of 30% owned for your running backs, with the Patriots defense and Deebo Samuel, projected to be 21% owned. You only have CJ Stroud and Curtis Samuel and Dalton Schultz under 5% owned.
Like, yeah, I mean, there's ways to do it. No, there's plenty of value. There's plenty of value, right? You just have to decide. There is plenty of value. So that's why you can make it work. And so it's kind of what I was saying before. It's like, just how good or bad do you feel about that value? I mean, Tracy's just while you bring him up, I just want to, I see both sides of the coin with Tracy. Like, there's the part of me that's like, road dog, terrible game script, bad team against Seattle. And then there's another part of me that's like 4,300. Like, what are we talking about?
Right.
And so I think look, because of the fact that there is a lot of value, there are a lot of injuries this week. I mean, that's part of why Green Bay is popping so hard, right? That I wouldn't be surprised to see like a Nico Collins, Stroud stack win everything, because Stroud is not going to be owned, and neither will Nico Collins. And look, I've been singing Nico Collins' praises for like the whole season so far. I mean, you don't have to convince me about him. So I get it. I think it's very viable. I mean, I think it has an extremely high ceiling. I just think that you just have to feel comfortable with the value, and there's a lot of value to your point, and I think that's what makes it viable.
Yeah. Can I make a comment really quick, by the way? Sorry, James, about Tyrone Tracy.
Yeah, go for it.
I was looking for ways, honestly, James, because when I saw the projection and I saw too, and I know we were talking about like Eric Gray. I keep coming back to one thing with Tyrone Tracy, and it's he's only fucking 4,300. Like, even if this is a 50-50 split of a backfield, 4,300. Like, what does he really need to pay that off? And I think I'm probably going to get a lot more of him than I originally thought I was going to, because he just opens up so much. And when I was toying around with Houston builds, he was almost like an auto click in there, and you're getting the ownership floor there. I think Tyrone Tracy's a much better play than maybe the models are indicating. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, to be clear, I like Tyrone Tracy a lot. He's $4,300. We should play a $4,300 starting running back.
Totally agree.
I like to Pablo's point of the two sides of the coin of like, oh well, we're not sure his workload and blah blah blah, and then the other side is just like $4,300 starting running back. Like, we should just play the 40, especially if we have a low stack. So I think that he's a natural pairing with Houston stacks.
I think he'd be a lot more. He is going to be owned, but he's not going to be super chalk. And I think the reason he's not going to be super chalk is because we have a week where people are playing Purdy, Geno Smith, Jordan Love, Trevor Lawrence, Joe Flacco. And so because people are not playing Stroud Collins stacks, they don't need Tracy value, right? So one way to get just different on the field is say, hey, you know what? I am going to pay up a quarterback with Stroud Collins at my stack, and then I'm just going to play Tracy, and he won't be 10%, but he's not going to be 50%. He'll probably be like, in small field, he'll be 25 to 30%, and in large field, he'll be probably 20%.
Right. Yeah. I think that Tyrone Tracy, like when we flip the cards here and he ends up being like 25 to 30% owned, and we see that and we're like, this is a $4,300 running back, he should have been 60. I think that will probably feel silly. So
let me ask you about what. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I thought we were moving on to a different game.
We are. I was going to say that is the stack that I am interested in. What about you, Mr. Pablo?
Well, I want to ask you guys about Seattle because I'm seeing, you know, here's where I'm at with Seattle. We know that they've been extremely pass heavy, and they should They should easily win this game. The only question I have is if Gino is owned, and he doesn't look crazy owned, but he'll be one of the top 5, I think, owned quarterbacks. It's kind of a decision in that game. Again, it's analogous to Jordan Mason. It's analogous to Jacobs in the Green Bay game. Is like if I'm not playing Gino, I think I want to play Kenny Walker. And it's just the question there is like, it's not about predicting the future. It's about, what is the population generally going to do? I think it'll probably be more common to play the quarterbacks we've already talked about, and people will probably mostly just play Kenny Walker from this game, which makes it more attractive to just play Gino. But it's one of those things where when you run Solver or whatever builder you use, you're gonna because DK is 7K and JSN is 5,800. Like both of them project to be okay value. Neither of them project to be amazing value. You just have to be okay that you're going to have to sort of veto what looks like a worse median in the name of ceiling, because like your teams that you build with Kenny Walker without Gino and without DK Metcalf and JSN are gonna have a much better median. And so you just have to sort of like decide you're doing that in the name of game theory.
Yeah. They do pass a lot, and they pass a lot over expectation too, right? Like they have the highest pass rate over expectation by not only the metrics over at Fantasy Life, which is drop back over expectation, but also like CPOE and stuff like that, like the more industry standard metrics. My issue is, man, do the Giants suck dick. Kenneth Walker is another one of those guys where I'm looking at him as a play, and I'm like, okay, he's 6,800. He just came off of a massive, massive week where he literally broke the 3-game slate. His usage has been great when he has been playing. Why would I not just slam him in? And it speaks to why Tyrone Tracy is not going to be as highly owned as he probably should be, because we have all of these running backs that just like are such good plays. I mean, Kenneth Walker had 75% of the rushing attempts last week, ran 50% of the routes, 67% of short down and distance, 100% of the inside the 5 attempts, like 100% of the inside the 5 attempts. They just give whoever the lead back is here, whether it's him or Charbonnet, they just let him fucking run free. So it's really hard not to just be like, oh, well, just gonna lock in Kenneth Walker. But that speaks to your point of Seattle stacks, I think, are valuable. I do really like DK Metcalf in a vacuum. I do really like Jackson Smith and Jigba in a vacuum. I don't know if I can stack them. I think I can play them as one-offs. I think that DK Metcalf could absolutely nuke. And I think that is enough leverage off of Kenneth Walker, who is going to be 20-something% owned. I think simply swapping to DK Metcalf is enough leverage for me. What about you? What about you, Jason?
So, I was really, really into Seattle stacks. Honestly, when I saw the matchup come out on Tuesday and I saw the pricing, just because they didn't get that Monday Night Football, factored into their pricing. I really, really liked Seattle stacks. Now I got to tell you, I kind of think I'm completely off of them. And here's why. Number one, James, you have them tied for the second highest drop back percentage in this upcoming week, but their passing touchdown expectation is relatively low, and it's lower than other teams that have similar drop back expectations. Conversely, you also have Seattle for the fourth highest rushing touchdown expectation this week. When Malik Neighbors got ruled out, I originally said to myself, like, yeah, I just don't think that it's really gonna, I don't think Gino's gonna have to do what he has to do to get them to win. I also think that you saw it last week, and it's actually, to your point about what they did with Charbonnet also, when they get inside the red zone, like the five, really when they get inside the 10-yard line, they do like to hand the ball off quite a bit. I like the plays in a vacuum. I just don't think I necessarily want to prioritize that stack when I don't think the other side is going to be super competitive more often than not. And lastly, this is actually something in the Giants' favor, which I was a little surprised to see. They're actually getting pressure on their quarterbacks that they're playing at a fairly decent rate. And Seattle's offensive line has actually been giving up a lot more pressure, actually a decent amount of pressure over expectation. So I don't think it's as great of a matchup for him personally and that offensive line as people really think. And I think if I want to attack that game, it's the same thing. One-off wide receivers. I'm probably a little bit higher on Ken Walker than I am most other running backs. I just think if they get anywhere near the goal line, they're just going to hand it off to him. But yeah, and it's really that. And then Tyrone Tracy on the other side. And if you want to take a stab at, Wandale or Slayton, I think they're decent values. But yeah, I don't think I really want to stack Seattle anymore. I was much higher on them until Neighbors got ruled out. Much, much higher.
Yeah, I'm with you guys in that. It feels a little bit like an overthink, not just to play Kenny Walker in that game. And I just I could see him. I could just see Seattle just like playing a very boring game, just running it with him all game long. He scores 2 touchdowns, breaks a long run, gets 140 yards, and you move on with your life. But because of that, I think a lot of people feel that way. I think if you're playing larger field, if you're playing 10 to 20 lineups, I'd have at least 1 or 2 Geno stacks without Walker.
Yeah, I agree with that. One more that I want to bring up here, and then we'll kind of move on to some final thoughts. But Jaden Daniels is probably going to be like 10% owned, which Jason, you alluded to this before we started recording, but that's just too low. He's 6,800. He should be priced at like 7,500. We still have at least a $700 discount on this kid. He's up against a Cleveland defense that is not good, not bad, but he's gonna get his one way or another. I think he projects for the second highest median on the slate over at Pater. Like, he's a really, really good play, and I think that people are. I'm not gonna say that we should be playing Deshaun Watson, but I do think that we should be playing Amari Cooper. Another wide receiver who I think is well underpriced here, kind of a very similar situation to Michael Pittman. I think Amari Cooper and Michael Pittman are both basically the same play this week, whereas Michael Pittman maybe has a better quarterback. But like, Jaden Daniels he's too cheap for his upside, and I think you can pair him with either Zach Ertz or Terry McLaurin, who's still underpriced for wide receiver 1 with this kind of quarterback. And he has 30 plus fantasy point upside as a QB, and it's going to be. I just think that he's too cheap. I think the game environment is really good. We really like Jerome Ford, but so do a lot of other people. Jerome Ford's probably going to be something like 15% owned, and the Cleveland passing game is going to be nothing owned. The Washington everything is basically going to be unowned. Brian Robinson is out, so we're going to likely have Austin Eckler, who is like the guy for Washington, which is interesting in its own right. I just think there's a lot of interesting things about this Washington-Cleveland spot, so I wanted to get some thoughts there.
Oh, James, Brian Robinson got ruled in.
Oh, cool. Okay, good. I don't have to fucking consider Austin Eckler. Sick. Okay, so anyway, Jaden Daniels and this game environment for a too cheap rushing QB.
I think Jaden Daniels, man, he's just such an easy click every week. He's still way too cheap for his upside. And the one thing I want to highlight here that most people seem to still be thinking, and I thought it at the beginning of the year too. And I've been listening to some industry podcasts to get a feel of the narrative that's being pushed out there. People are still trying to say that this Cleveland defense is one of the elite defenses in the league, and honestly, they have not been that at all. They just haven't. And I think you're getting a quarterback here who really is a tough matchup for them. They play a ton of man-to-man defense, and the one thing about them that they also do, they play a lot of what's called static coverage, meaning they don't disguise anything from you at the beginning of the line, at the line of scrimmage. They've been like that with this. I forgot the D coordinator's name. Is it Schwartz there? Whoever he is, he's been there for quite a number of years. They do the same thing every single time. Do I think that Jaden Daniels is going to throw for 303 touchdowns? No, but if he has a week to prepare of the same coverages that he's going to see every single down, and they seem to be making the game easy for him. It's tough not to like him, man. And I think that Terry McLaurin's a good enough weapon to get open against this man coverage. I think he's got really cheap stacking options, and I personally love him in this game this week, and I also think because Cleveland's going to have an easier time moving the ball and scoring, in my opinion, that's just going to push him a little bit. It didn't take Arizona much to really get Jaden Daniels going, and I'm going to be very overexposed to him tomorrow in MME sets and my small field. He's going to be making one or two of my 5 for sure. I'm very high on Jaden Daniels tomorrow, very very high.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points. I think I don't really have anything to add to what you guys said on Daniel. I think he's been an incredible player so far this year, and he seems to be fairly matchup proof. And Cleveland defense, by no means is a pushover, but like they haven't. Similar to your point on Indianapolis being a little better than maybe people are making them out to be, I also think Cleveland's defense hasn't been like this incredible shutdown defense this year either. And I don't know that I care even if they are. Like if Daniels isn't owned, he seems to be fairly matchup proof so far. I think you can play him naked. I think if you want, I think McLaurin projects okay, not great. So you just have to be willing to sacrifice there relative to some of the other options in that sort of 6K price range. The only other point I was going to make is more of a macro point on tight end, which I think tight end this week, as you pointed out before, James, is going to be like super, super heavy concentrated on Kraft. And I'm not endorsing Kraft. I will say the only situation that I wouldn't be mad at you for playing Kraft is if you're correlating him, but I would never play him uncorrelated outside of cash. And I do think one thing you should be looking to do with your quarterbacks is to either pair your tight end with him or play a tight end opposite as a mini with someone. So I think one thing you could do, like you mentioned, James, is play Ertz. I was going to mention one last game, and I think then probably we've covered all the big spots. And but I just think we should at least mention this game before we do that. Is a version of Buffalo, Houston. It's a very similar situation in that the stacking partners are pricey, and it'll be very low owned outside of a couple of individual plays, which is Burrow stacks. You can play Burrow, Chase, Higgins, but it is very similar to the situation with Stroud, Collins, and company. Burrow 6,400, not that much, but Chase is 8K. That's very, very pricey. Higgins is 6K, manageable, not crazy. And then Gesicki is only 3,400 and kind of checks that tight end box. I think the only plays that I'm seeing both on the sheets and then from the other sources in the industry that I check, the only plays in this game that are going to garner any meaningful ownership are Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson. So I think if you simply play Burrow stack with Henry opposite that, that's one way to approach this game, and I think it is similar to Houston Buffalo. My only hesitation with Cincinnati Baltimore, and I can't prove this with any data, but is that they are division rivals. I don't know. These games sometimes I feel like have a tendency to sometimes go turn into more of an under. They know each other really well, and teams that know each other really well, and I think in general, especially when it's a division rival, frequently the game doesn't shoot out as much as people would like. So that's my only note of hesitation. Admittedly, more of a narrative than based on data. But I think it's worth pointing out that Burrow stacks will not be owned, and you can still eat a fairly chalky Henry across that because Burrow stacks won't be owned.
Yeah. I'll give some thoughts on this before I pass to Jason, but I do really like the Baltimore Cincinnati spot. My issue with it comes down to I think that Cincinnati has been pedestrian. Joe Burrow's health is still in question. We saw him have a really good game against the worst pass defense in the league, and now he has to deal with Baltimore, who admittedly is allowing some deep passes, right? Like they are still averaging a lot of passing yards over average. But I think that they are certainly a step up from Washington in terms of the defensive schemes that they use. So I'm a little bit worried about that. And after that, it's like, okay, if I'm interested in Cincinnati, who the fuck do I even use from Baltimore? I guess I use Zay Flowers, but if that game is going to be competitive enough for Joe Burrow to end up winning you a GPP, like how does it end up being competitive? And the only answers that I can come up with are either Derrick Henry or Lamar Jackson. So that leads me to think that I should probably instead be playing Lamar Jackson with Jamar Chase and I don't know, Isaiah Likely or something, or Zay Flowers maybe, and hoping that Lamar Jackson has that 35-point outburst, and then that's how the game stays competitive and high scoring. But it's just a weird spot that rubs me the wrong way, and I don't really have a great reason for why.
Yeah, I'll let Jason chime in, but I feel very similar. Like when I saw the totals and I saw that game, I was sort of like, okay, how do I play this game? And then as I started to try to play with builds and use it, it was just it's I think it's priced in a way with the plays that have upside, where it's more attractive in theory than it is in reality when you start to build lineups. But Jason, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No, you're good, man. I agree with you guys, and I think the one aspect of this game that really turns me off from stacking it as opposed to wanting to really attack it is it's also really what these teams are going to want to do. Like we have Baltimore right now for the second highest rushing touchdown expectation on the entire week, regardless of any game. And I said this on the bakery too, but it really is a true thing. You guys got to check out this account on Twitter called the Coach Speak Index. I followed it for a couple years, and it basically assigns a grading on a reliability scale on what certain coaches say about certain situations, their personnel, injury updates, usage, everything. And Harbaugh himself is a known like oversharer. Like the guy will, if the guy buried a body in his backyard, he's probably going to tell you about it at a press conference. Very similar to Mike Malone in the NBA, for those who follow NBA news. He's the guy just tells you everything. And he has come out and said that we're going to run a bunch of double, large personnel, 12-man personnel, 2 tight ends. They really want to run the ball. Todd Monken has said that, we're going to lean into this more and more. They actually asked him, what's been with Mark Andrews' lack of usage in the pass game. And Harbaugh responded with, oh, I didn't even realize that Mark Andrews didn't get that many looks. Like we think really highly here of Mark, but I didn't realize he didn't get any looks. These guys just want to run the fucking ball. And I don't think Cincinnati has shown any ability to be able to stop that. So I think if you attack this game, the pricing makes it uncomfortable. Jamar Chase, do I really want to pay $8K for fucking 7 targets? And James, you said it so eloquently on the bakery. Do I want to hope for another fucking 60-yard touchdown for this guy to hit a ceiling? Like if you want to go to T. Higgins, okay. You want to take a stab on Mike Gesicki, and some people even pushing this Eric All character who they think is taking his snaps, but he's really not. I just don't love it outside of outside of Henry, or maybe you want to take a shot on Lamar. I will say though, if you do want to try and figure out which one of those Cincinnati running backs it's going to be my guest. I don't really have an interest. They seem to be splitting a lot of work and a lot of snaps. I just think for me, it's either I'm going to go Derrick Henry in this game, or like I'll do like a Lamar skinny and I'm done. I can't really pay anything else in this game. Pay for anything else, I should say.
Yeah, it's just not. I don't know. It just feels weird, and I don't really want to play Derrick Henry for a multitude of reasons. The main being that I do think that Cincinnati can get a lead, and if Cincinnati gets a lead, Derrick Henry ain't touching the ball. So you have to play for a very specific game circumstance for this game to end up going well. And I think that what we have talked about is that very specific game instance has to deal with Joe Burrow stacked with Jamar Chase and insert wide receiver 2 here and bring it back with Derrick Henry. That is the only way that I think that this game really pops off, is if Derrick Henry crushes. So if you want to play this game, I think that's the way that you have to build it. And that way is going to be weird because Derrick Henry is the most expensive running back on the slate at 7,800. So goes back to having to like the value. That said, doing something where it's like Joe Burrow plus Tyrone Tracy plus Derrick Henry, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins, like that's totally viable. There's nothing wrong with that. Or Gesicki instead of T. Higgins, like that's fine. But you do have to like the value. So I think that we have covered pretty much everything that is worthwhile covering here. Pablo, do you have any closing thoughts here?
No, I mean, I think it's a good slate to just be very conscious of what chalk you're eating and where your leverage is. I think it's because it's a smaller slate now. The spots are more obvious, and I think I would be cognizant of both under leveraging and over leveraging. I think it'll be easy to do either one, and I think you need to just be very conscious of how different you're getting for your field size. I always tell people, like, you need a minimum amount of leverage you need to have enough win equity, right? Like, you need enough leverage so that if you achieve the outcomes that your lineup is built for, you have a chance to get first for GPPs. I think it's a better problem if you're over leveraged for GPPs than if you're under leveraged, because if you're over leveraged, if your stuff does okay but not great, you still have a chance to min cash. If you're under leveraged and your stuff does okay but not great, you're not min cashing and you're certainly not winning. So I think don't be afraid, I think, to build a little more leverage this week than you think you may feel comfortable doing, because I think the good plays do feel generally fairly good. But also just be aware of how much leverage you're building and balance sort of that cash equity versus that win equity. And for GPPs, you need enough win equity or you shouldn't be playing GPPs.
Jason, close nuts.
Closing thoughts for me are just don't make too many mistakes this week. Especially with where we see ownership go. I know some plays may look like good leverage plays. I think there's going to be more win equity this week in just playing the good plays the right way. And I think this is another week where you're going to see game theory players and people that are not, just contest sims and optimizer, users. I think you're going to see really strong game theory players have success this week. So just think that through when you're building your lineups. You want to make sure if you're leveraging off of a certain leverage point, that it's worthwhile. And just one tip I want to give everybody to how to do that. If you go into the optimizer at the solver, you can lock a stack that you want to play. Lock that stack in with whatever stacking pieces you think are best, and then just run it on ownership for 50 lineups. Run it on projected ownership and see what the real chalk combination combos are. And if your stack is very low owned, you might be able to just keep what's there. That might even be the smartest. If you're playing a bigger field, you maybe want to pivot off of another one or two. So just be very thoughtful of the really good plays this week. Don't avoid them. Just play them the smartest way that you think you can.
Yeah, my closing thought here is going to be you can there are so many good plays this week that I think that it's going to be much easier to find success in small field by getting different with your stack and your QB than it is to be getting different with your one-offs. Like I said, I want to lock Michael Pittman. I want to lock Kenneth Walker. Jordan Mason is an incredible. Like all these guys that we talked about, there are so many good high-owned plays that I'm finding it much easier to be like, okay, well, I can lock in all those guys and then just get different by going with Matthew Stafford instead of Jordan Love, and getting different that way. Or I can lock in these great values like Dontavian Wicks and Tyrone Tracy and just have a Houston stack where I have a sum aggregate ownership of like 30% or something. So that's going to be the way that I approach GPPs this week. Is just going to be looking at trying to get different with my stacks and with my QB rather than getting different with my one-offs. So that's going to do it for us. We've been going for about an hour or so. We will get this uploaded onto the YouTubes and inserted into the thoughts and notes for tomorrow. Thank you guys for tuning in. Again, if you are in the Discord and you're not subscribed here at Pater, you should do that. It gives you a little bit more context into what we're talking about here. Obviously, appreciate the support as well. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to end the recording now.